Good morning, Dragons. It's time for another fantastic social studies lesson with Mr. Moss. Last time we spoke, we talked about the age of exploration. We talked about why Europeans began getting on ships and sailing around the world looking for new places. Now, their big goal was to find uh, a route to Asia, right? A really fast route to Asia that they could get there by the ocean and hopefully get a bunch of their spices and furs and other luxury items like that they could trade with. But Columbus, right, discovered America, and it leads to a bunch of Europeans sticking their flags all over the place in North and South America. Uh, what we're going to talk about today will be the Native Americans before Columbus, right? What did it look like before Europeans kind of got there? We're going to point out some of the misconceptions about Native Americans, and hopefully we all do it. This video should be about 8 minutes because apparently that's the sweet spot for uploading it and having no issues. So I'm gonna get rid of my face, and we'll start. All right. So, starting it off here with my Homeland Security picture, right? It's a nice perspective, right? To think about these Native American individuals being, right, the Homeland Security, right? Fighting terrorism as they saw it, right? Terrorism coming from invading Europeans since 1492. Um, and we'll get more into when they start fighting and having conflict. There's going to be plenty of that between Europeans and the natives. But just realize that disease is going to play such a huge role in weakening Native Americans, right? Disease, and there's a lot of different diseases that'll do it: smallpox, measles, influenza. These diseases brought over by Europeans, natives had never encountered before. So they had no resistance, and it's going to wipe out huge amounts of them. But again, we'll talk about more about that later. So, learning goal. I want to make sure you all realize just a couple of ways how Native Americans adapted to their various environments. Guys, there were natives from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. There were hundreds of different tribes who had different cultures, different ways of life. Obviously, depending on where you lived, you have to use what's around you, right? Just like Bear Grylls here is telling us, improvise, adapt, overcome. Native Americans had to use the resources at hand, and those resources would affect their lifestyles and some of the ways in which they made things or even the materials used. So, moving on. So, real quick, true or false question for you. At the time of Columbus and other Europeans' arrival to the Americas, the Native Americans were primitive with low levels of technology. Is that true or is that false? If you answered false, you are correct. Native Americans are thought to be of like primitive, right? But they are actually extremely advanced. Native American populations before Columbus showed up are estimated to be between 7 and 16 million. Uh, so, why did Europeans see Native Americans as primitive? It comes down to Native Americans being different, right? So, when Europeans showed up, they looked a lot like this. They had pretty much they're clothed head to toe. A lot of times they have on some type of metal armor. They have metal swords. They have firearms, right? They have muskets. But if you know, like Native Americans, they don't have those things. Most of the time, they are not going to be clothed head to toe, especially if it's super hot out. That doesn't make sense. They don't have metal working, so they don't have metal tools. They don't have metal armor. They don't have firearms, right? But they have other things. They have other technologies that make up for it, right? Uh, one of these Spanish muskets, you may fire one bullet a minute, whereas a Native American in his bow could shoot off, a dozen arrows in that time. So again, just because it's different doesn't necessarily mean it's less, right? Native Americans, and we're going to get into a lot more of their contributions later It's much more than that, but just to keep it simple. When you think of a Native American, most people think of this, right? They have the feather in the hair, no shirt, maybe a little war paint of some kind. And again, this is just a stereotypical view of a native, right? There are a lot of different examples. Again, a lot of different tribes, a lot of different uh, styles of clothing, a lot of different styles of jewelry, right? Um, so before Columbus shows up, there are three large empires of Native Americans. There are the Aztecs, which are super duper famous. It's like a warrior culture in what basically is Mexico. You have the Mayans, who were super duper smart and freaked everyone out with their calendar, right? Because everyone thought in 2012 the world was going to end. And then you have the Inca in South America running all along that western coast, right down here. And they have some pretty amazing accomplishments as well. So again, Aztecs are warriors, right? And their entire culture and civilization is based on domination of other tribes and bringing them in. But Cortez and the Spaniards will completely dominate them. And it's not because they have much better weapons, but basically disease, a lot of it was. Over here, we have what's called Machu Picchu. The Inca would build a lot of times these magnificent cities high in the mountains. And they were able to farm up there, and it's up there for defense. It's hard to get to, right? And tourists, you could, maybe some of you have been there today, but you can go there, right? Machu Picchu. And then down here is a calendar from the Mayans. And the Mayans, really smart astrologers. They were able to predict like eclipses for centuries ahead of time. They predicted them, right? So again, these civilizations are much more advanced. They're not primitive savages running around, shooting each other with bow and arrows. No, far from it. In fact, most historians agree that without native assistance, Europeans who came over and tried to settle would have failed. I can tell you for sure, Jamestown and Plymouth, right, are two founding colonies for the United States. Those two places definitely would have failed without native assistance. Uh, you have, with the Pilgrims, you had Squanto, who showed them all kinds of things, which we'll talk about later. And over with Jamestown, you had, the famous Pocahontas, who was real, and her tribe, who actually would trade and sometimes get into fights, but oftentimes would help John Smith and the colonists of Virginia. So, reason we went over all of that. You notice these different sections on this map, tribes that are similar and in the same area. We call that a cultural region. So we have the Eastern Woodlands, Southeast, Great Plains, Southwest, California Intermountain Plateau, and Northwest Coast. These are the 7 different cultural regions of Native American tribes. And what you're going to do for your independent assignment is you're going to go through and read about each region. You're going to list off a couple of the tribes that are found there. Some of them you might recognize. You're also going to tell me about a couple of artifacts that are found there. Artifacts can be, what they wore, things that they made to live in. I know most of us think all natives lived in teepees, but that's incorrect. They had a bunch of different types of housing. And you're going to tell me, how does that show evidence that they adapted? To give you a perfect example, in the Southwest, basically this is all desert area. They don't have trees. So when they're thinking about what are we going to make to live in our houses, they're going to make their houses out of mud brick because they have, it's desert. They just take basically the ground and they soften it by wetting it and putting it into molds and making bricks, and they create their housing using adobe. That's what it's called, adobe. And that's how they adapted. because again, they don't have trees, they don't have anything, they don't have lumber to make their houses out of, so they have to make it with something. So they use adobe. That's one way. Again, they adapted to their environment. So your job is going to be to show me how these Native Americans adapted to their environment. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and hopefully I will see everyone in our live sessions later today. See ya.